Hello and welcome to Between the Rows. I'm Ed White, your host this week. What's going on with old crop and new crop canola as Western Canada runs out of the old and prepares to seed the new into parched soils?
I guess the commercials are trying to bring that last little bit of canola that's still out there, and we're seeing gains for the new crop months, like November and January, but they're nowhere near as much as for the old crop months.
Glenn Halleck of Markets Farm joins us later to talk about that. What does Health Canada's ruling on neonicotinoids mean for Canada's canola growers and the canola industry?
These kind of tools like neonics seed treatments are important. You need these things at certain times of the year to make sure that you do have a crop and that you don't have to spend tens of thousands of dollars to reseed your crop.
Robert Arnason of the Western Producer will join us later to talk about that. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Your soil has a unique story. At Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, we get that. Start using precise nutrient information to get optimal crop performance. Try our variable rate program risk-free today. Visit decisivefarming.com. Conditions apply.
What happens when coal and agriculture collide? Along the backbone of the continent, you'll find the source of a river that's essential to life in southern Alberta. Tributaries of the Oldman River flow through the Rocky Mountains, part of a landscape Albertans celebrate and tourists from around the world visit. But if open-pit coal mining at the headwaters of the Oldman is allowed to go ahead, this major river system will likely never be the same again. Ranchers are leading the opposition to the provincial government's changes to mining restrictions in the eastern slopes. Canadian cattleman reporter Piper Whalen has been covering this story. This week she speaks with Lars Sander Green, the mining lead for the conservation organization Wildsight, on the potential risks of water contamination from open-pit coal mining.
There's a lot of different tributaries that are getting polluted, and some of those smaller creeks are just dead. There's no fish left. Or in the upper areas, we had a big fish collapse. The population collapsed. 93% of the adult fish disappeared in 2 years.
Lars Sander Green has been monitoring the water quality in BC's Elk River, and his findings are troubling. His work with Wildsight focuses on the impact of Teck Resources' metallurgical coal mines in the Elk Valley. This area is dealing with toxic levels of selenium in its water. Sander Green can't say for sure what will happen if open-pit mining goes ahead on the other side of the Rockies, but he believes Alberta needs to take the threat of water contamination more seriously.
And I think in Alberta, could be some pretty significant concerns with, you've got municipal water intakes downstream, of course, irrigation, livestock. There's a lot more water uses that we don't have on our side that could be a concern for more than just fish.
Ranchers near the proposed mines feel the risk to Alberta's water is too great. Scientists, municipalities, and First Nations have echoed this argument.
The government says it's cutting red tape, but critics say there's not enough oversight and worry about long-term cumulative effects on the land.
When you're doing these kinds of things in these watersheds that affect these communities, you need to consult. It's governance 101.
We're not anti-resource for sustainable development, but things that change our landscape and threaten the health of our waters and people and animals, that's a whole different topic.
With this type of mining, selenium is the main pollutant that leaches into the water.
It's an element that we need in our diet and that all life needs, but if there's a little bit too much, it can be pretty dangerous. And even at the levels that we're talking about in the Elk River, which are parts per billion, like tiny amounts, it can be dangerous for fish and can disrupt their ability to reproduce. Basically, either they can't reproduce at all, like their eggs just don't hatch, or when they do hatch, they come out with, fry that have a back that's a Z or something and just don't survive.
That's not the only pollutant that shows up in water near open pit mines.
One of them is nitrates, which come from the explosives that are used in the mine. And then we've got sulfate and nickel. It's a heavy metal, known from other mining operations for sure. And calcite, which basically causes the stream bed to turn into concrete.
The problem goes far beyond the mines. In the Elk Valley, contaminated water flows downstream into Montana and Idaho before returning it to Canada. If this were to happen at the headwaters of the Old Man River, toxic levels of selenium could flow eastward across the prairie provinces.
It's such, when you start, feeding from the Rocky Mountains down, you're covering a pretty big area, and of course on such a long time scale, it's really a serious problem that I think we need to take a lot more seriously than we are taking, through the environmental assessment process and the different regulatory processes that are happening right now.
Sander Green tells me that Teck Resources has put a lot of money into its water treatment facilities, but he sees these efforts as too little, too late.
The big worry there is, first of all, they're treating like a minuscule proportion of the total amount of polluted water. It's not really making a measurable impact at this point. And secondly, that most of these pollution problems are expected to continue for centuries, probably.
A problem that will continue for centuries. And he doesn't expect the water treatment facilities to stick around either.
Once mining ends and there's no money to run the treatment plants, well, we're going to see that pollution problem come right back. And that's especially true because Teck is spending, hundreds of millions of dollars a year on water treatment in the Elk Valley. So there's just no way that that's going to continue once that coal money is not coming in anymore.
He doesn't hold with the province of Alberta's argument that strict water standards will solve the issue.
I think what we've seen so far is most of the mines on the Alberta side sort of say, oh, we'll just treat the water and it'll all be fine. Teck is doing it in the Elk Valley, don't worry about it. And from our experience of what's happening in the Elk Valley is there's a lot of promises and not a lot of real solutions. So I'd be pretty worried about what might happen in Alberta.
Alberta Energy Minister Sonia Savage announced a public consultation period on a new coal policy, beginning in late March. The minister's office didn't reply to an earlier request for comment by press time. Despite the province's backpedaling on coal mining, many of the proposed mines are still moving towards approval. Sander Green would like to see a regional assessment in Alberta ahead of any decisions.
I think a lot of people are starting to talk that way, that the federal government needs to do a regional environmental assessment and not look at one project or another project, one by one, but actually look at the big picture, including those, downstream water issues, and kind of reach some broader conclusions that can then be used in those environmental assessments, or could, be used to send a strong message to people who are considering a coal mine that, hey, this doesn't work. This isn't what Albertans want, and we don't have a handle on this water pollution problem.
That reporting was by Piper Whalen of Canadian Cattlemen. This is Between the Rows. There's been big news about an essential canola pesticide. And now I welcome to the show Robert Arnason, a reporter with the Western Producer. Hello, Robert, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Ed, I'm glad to be here.
So, Robert, for years now, you've been covering this issue of the neonics that were being reviewed, and of great concern to everybody involved with canola. Can you give us a little bit of a catch-up on what exactly has happened?
Sure. We'll just kind of start with a quick reminder here. So most people probably know what neonics are, but they're used in the canola industry, as a seed treatment mostly. They go on the seed, and then when the seedling emerges, the neonic deters or kind of stops flea beetles from feeding on the canola seedlings early in the season. There are cases where if you don't have seed treatment, or if you have a huge number of flea beetles in the field, it can totally destroy the crop and never get started. And there's been many instances in Western Canada where canola growers have had to reseed their canola just because the flea beetle population has been so intense that basically it just totally devastates the crop at that early, very sensitive stage. Neonics are also used, on corn and on a lot of horticultural crops in Ontario. And that's kind of where this problem started. So going back, I guess, about 5 or 6 years, Health Canada came out and said basically that they're going to ban one of the 3 neonics, and the name of that neonic is called imidacloprid. And what Health Canada had found is that this particular neonic was accumulating in like ponds and creeks and other water bodies near horticultural crops, I guess vegetable crops, greenhouses in parts of Ontario. And they found that the levels of the neonics were so high in the water bodies that it was a threat to aquatic insects. And when I say aquatic insects, I'm talking about things like mayflies and midges. And therefore, if it was a threat to these aquatic insects, it's also a threat to the animals that feed on those insects, mostly birds, because then they wouldn't have a food source. So based out of that concern, Health Canada said it was going to phase out or ban the use of this one neonic imidacloprid. And then a couple of years later, in 2018, Health Canada made the same decision regarding the two other neonics, which I'm not going to try to name because if I try to pronounce their names, I'll embarrass myself. But anyway, there's two other neonics that are widely used in Canada, and Health Canada basically said we're also going to phase out the use of those over a 5-year period because of the risk to aquatic insects.
Now, if I had to pronounce those, here's my guess. Tell me if it sounds right to you. I would say thiamethoxam and clothianidin.
Yeah, sometimes I call it clothianidin. So, it depends on your pronunciation, but those are the two chemicals. One is clothianidin is made by Bayer, the other one is made by Syngenta. So when Health Canada announced these bans, there was quite a bit of pushback from groups like the Canadian Canola Growers Association and also the Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers. So their complaint, which I think was a valid one, which is they said, well, Health Canada, you're kind of making this decision based on computer models. So sort of assuming that, okay, we have this problem in one part of Ontario, and then you're sort of like extrapolating that data to say, okay, we have a similar problem with these neonics accumulating in creeks and sloughs and water bodies all across Canada. And the farmers and commodity groups, well, that's not reasonable. And they kind of pushed back and said we should do actual water monitoring tests. So actually take water samples from across Canada, across the prairies to kind of get a sense of, well, is this actually true? Are these neonics accumulating in water at a level that's actually a threat to these aquatic insects or not?
And part of that, if I remember right, is because it's a different treatment, which is a tightly bonded seed treatment, which is different to a lot of how it was applied in Ontario on other crops.
That's right.
And also, obviously, different environment, different crop, different, so many different things. And yet the extrapolations from the sort of Ontario situation were just being applied across Western Canada as well.
That's right. So then that led to Alberta Agriculture, the Canadian canola growers actually going out and funding and go ahead and doing testing. And so they collected samples, like I don't know how many, hundreds and hundreds of water samples from near canola fields across the West. And when they came back with their findings, it showed pretty clearly that the actual levels were very low and, not a risk to these aquatic insects. So Health Canada, to its credit, was actually very involved in this whole water monitoring program. They were open to listening to this additional information, and they took their time. They took actually years to review all this additional data. And then last week, I forget the date now, but I think it was on Wednesday or Thursday last week, they essentially said, okay, we looked at all the data, and we've decided that we are not going to ban these two neonics, clothianidin, sorry, I can never pronounce that, and thiamethoxam. And so basically they reversed their position. They went from a ban to a new position on these two neonics, saying, okay, well, you can continue to use them with some restrictions on certain crops. So seed treatments are still okay for canola.
And that's how most canola growers use it, right?
That's right. So for some other crops, like say corn or soybean and some horticultural crops, farmers are going to have to use reduced rates, whether it be seed treatments or foliar application. So there have been some changes to the rules, but in terms of canola, growers are still permitted to use these neonics just as they had before.
So what does that mean?
Well, I guess what I took away from this decision is that the system works. So in the last few years, I've heard quite a few complaints from commodity groups, kind of off the record, saying, they're fearful that Health Canada and the Pest Management Regulatory Agency is kind of moving towards what they described as the precautionary principle, which is more like a European approach where you kind of ban pesticides or crop protection products just because, there could be a risk. There doesn't have to be actually concrete evidence. You just feel that, out of caution, we'll ban them. So I think what this decision by Health Canada signals is that they are still an evidence-based organization. They're going to make decisions based on sound science. And that sends a huge signal to farmers in the ag industry that, we live in a system in Canada here where if a technology is proven to be safe, we're going to be allowed to use that technology. So that, in big picture, is a big deal moving forward. I guess in terms of canola, as I said off the hop there, that in the early time of the year, that kind of late May, early June period, or into kind of like mid-June, flea beetles could completely devastate some individual farmers' canola crop. And so, these kind of tools like neonics seed treatments are important. You need these things at certain times of the year to make sure that you do have a crop and that you don't have to spend tens of thousands of dollars to reseed your crop. And also, it could have an impact on your yield as well, right? If you get too much flea beetle damage early in the season, at the end of the day, that could or will probably likely impact what kind of yield you get in your canola crop. So it has, I guess, an impact on the macro level in terms of Health Canada policy, but also it has an impact at the farm level, this Health Canada decision.
And, in terms of the canola industry and its long-term potential, we've for years now been covering the rather bold 2025 goals of the Canola Council to, greatly increase production. I would assume if farmers weren't able to use these products that are so vital against flea beetle control early in the season, those goals would have been even harder to strive towards.
Yeah, absolutely. I think every, there's a lot of components that go into yield. I'm not a professional agronomist, but, all different tools help you get to that end goal of whether you're targeting 50 or 55 or 60 bushels of canola per acre. So definitely taking away the neonic option, would hurt yield in many instances. But I guess the way I look at this from a bigger picture is, okay, let's just pretend hypothetically that Health Canada stuck with this decision and neonics were banned based on very little evidence. Okay, then that means the next technology might also come under attack from, advocacy groups, environmental groups, whatever it might be. And then based on that pressure, Health Canada might say, okay, well, we're going to get rid of this fungicide or this other tool, right? And then all of a sudden you've got a huge problem like they have in Europe where the farmers are losing, it seems like every month or every year they're kind of like a new product or a different product is being banned or phased out over there. And European farmers are seeing the effect of that where their rapeseed acres, are under pressure. And some farmers are turning away from that crop because they don't feel like they can grow it anymore. So yes, I think the real big impact, in my opinion, here is that this kind of means that farmers will likely have the tools they'll need to get better yields, provided there's evidence showing that those technologies, pesticides, crop control products, or crop protection products are safe. Pardon me. So.
Right. So yeah, this is I guess the preservation of an ability to move forward with production, with products, with some sort of feeling of confidence that you'll at least for sure get a fair hearing of the product. It won't just be kind of cavalierly banned, which was, I think, how a lot of people felt a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I think if we go back with neonics about 9 or 10 years, they had the situation in Ontario where there was dust, neonic dust from corn seed during a very dry spring, had kind of like drifted over and killed quite a few bee colonies. And that led to an incredible amount of like news coverage and political pressure and public pressure to kind of like do something about neonics. And, there was also flat out pressure to ban neonics to protect bees. But again, Health Canada took their time. They looked into the issue. And in 2019, after like years and years of study, they said, no, we don't think neonics are a systemic risk to bees. These products can be used safely, if you follow the label instructions and such. So again, those two decisions, like regarding neonics in the last couple of years, really send a message that, Health Canada is kind of close to the USDA and also the EPA in terms of following like a science-based approach, which is, I think, really good news for farmers.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, Robert. It's been a long and winding road, as they say, and I'm sure the road is not completely over. These things always tend to have a long tail to the tail. But thanks very much for joining us today and catching us up on a rather important development for farmers.
All right, Ed, I'm glad to be here. Cheers.
Robert Arnason is a reporter with the Western Producer. This is Between the Rows. And now for an update on the markets, I'm joined by Glenn Halleck of Markets Farm. Hello, Glenn, and welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me, Ed.
So, Glenn, it's been an absolutely crazy few months with canola prices and canola futures, both old crop and new crop. What's going on now, I guess, with that situation of the old crop? There almost being no old crop left, and the new crop further getting itself priced out there into the fall months.
Yeah, what we're seeing now is the contracts for May and July. The old crop months are shooting back up again. I guess the commercials are trying to wring that last little bit of canola that's still out there, and we're seeing gains for the new crop months. Like November and January, but they're nowhere near as much as for the old crop months. On one hand, you got the prospect of more acres than anticipated being planted this year. Agriculture Canada was looking at about 20 million acres. We'll have to see whether or not that's going to go up, and then we'll have to see by how much. And then you have the just a cold stone reality that across much of the prairies it is very, very dry, and that's going to put a bit of a price premium on canola.
Now I know the old wisdom used to be, when canola was much less hardy, that if things were dry, people would cut back on canola because it was just so touchy and the yield would collapse compared to tougher crops like the cereals and some of the others. Well, what's the view these days in the market? What do people think farmers will do if it gets dry with our new improved varieties and I guess better management?
Yeah, it's really hard to say because we got such good prices across the board, be it canola, wheat, corn. There's a real strong competition between all of the major crops as to how things are going to shake out. Coming into this year, and as we went through winter, there was a lot of talk. There's going to be this vast sea of yellow across the prairies. Now you're not hearing as much as that. So, it's going to be interesting to see whether or not we get more canola or perhaps even less.
And with canola, as always, we talk a lot about the canola-specific fundamentals, but, as always, the underlying canola price tends to be set off soy oil. What's the story there? What's going on with soy oil, and how does canola fit in with that?
Yeah. In general, right now, across the world, there's strong demand for all sorts of vegetable oils, one of them being soybean oil. And we've seen soybean oil, almost rising by a half cent to even a penny or more per day. And that's just pulling up canola. Basically where soy oil goes, canola follows. And we've seen increases over the last few days, and canola is tagging along.
And with the dryness out there, I mean, that's bad for every crop. It's bad for figuring out what farmers are going to be feeling going into into seeding. What's the talk on that now? Is the fear of using the D word, drought, creeping into the market in a big way yet, or is it just I guess a contributory factor to the overall price structure?
Yeah, right now I would say it's still in the background. Maybe later on this month it'll come more to the forefront. We're in April. Things can change on a dime. We may not get any rain. Next thing you know, we're getting rain. But like my colleague at Markets Farm, Bruce Burnett, says, it's not so much the moisture in the topsoil that you got to watch for. It's the moisture in the subsoil. Right now, all of those moisture reserves in the ground are pretty much used up. So things are really, really dry across the prairies.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of farmers are going out driving around their thawing fields and digging down with their knives to see what's a few inches down, and probably in a lot of areas not finding much.
Yeah. I've heard one report. There's a farmer out west of Portage that, he's got over 3,000 acres seeded already of various crops.
Yeah. So they'll be hoping some kind of moisture follows pretty quick once you got it in. I guess that's it. You want it a bit dry to go in, and then get lots of nice moisture once the seed's down there. But I guess we'll just have to trust in the weather.
Yes, we will.
Well, thanks very much, Glenn, for joining us. Appreciate your time today.
Oh, thanks so much, Ed.
That was Glenn Halleck of Markets Farm, and this is Between the Rows. That's all for this week. Join us next week for another edition of Between the Rows. I'm Ed White, and it was my pleasure to be your host.
Your soil has a unique story. At Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, we get that. Start using precise nutrient information to get optimal crop performance. Try our variable rate program risk-free today. Visit decisivefarming.com. Conditions apply.